A group of terror in white robes ruled the South through fear and violence. They believed no one could stop them. Then came the soldiers, black men who had fought for the Union, earned their freedom, and refused to bow down. What happened next shocked the entire nation. If you want to hear one of the most powerful stories in American history that barely gets told, stay with me until the end. And if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button, because we're uncovering the hidden chapters of history that changed everything. The year was 1871, and the American South was burning. Not with the fires of war this time, but with something far more sinister. 6 years after the Civil War ended, a new kind of terror had taken root in the former Confederacy. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan, and they moved through the darkness like ghosts, leaving destruction in their wake. Picture this: midnight in rural South Carolina. A family of freed slaves sleeps in their small cabin, finally experiencing something they'd only dreamed of during bondage: peace. Then comes the thunder of hooves. Torches appear in the distance. Men in white robes and hoods surround the home. Within minutes, everything this family built since emancipation is reduced to ashes. And the local sheriff? Either he's wearing a hood himself, or he's looking the other way. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of Black Americans trying to build new lives in the South. The KKK had emerged in 1866, just 1 year after the war ended, and by 1871, they had become the largest terrorist organization America had ever seen. They operated across 9 states, with an estimated 500,000 members. Their mission was simple and brutal: use violence and fear to restore white supremacy and destroy any hope of black freedom. The tactics were calculated and cruel. Night raids became their signature. They would descend on black communities without warning, dragging people from their homes, beating them in front of their families, burning down churches and schools. They targeted black people who dared to vote, who dared to own land, who dared to educate themselves or their children. They also went after white Republicans who supported Reconstruction and racial equality. Anyone who threatened the old order became a target. And here's what made it so terrifying. The Klan wasn't just a random mob. They were organized. They had a hierarchy, a command structure, communication networks across state lines. Many of their members were Confederate veterans who knew how to plan military operations. Local law enforcement was often infiltrated or intimidated into silence. County sheriffs, judges, even state officials, many either belonged to the Klan or were too afraid to oppose them. For black communities across the South, there was nowhere to turn, no one to call, no protection coming. By 1870, the violence had reached a fever pitch. In South Carolina alone, the Klan was responsible for hundreds of murders and thousands of beatings in just a 2-year span. Entire counties lived under what amounted to martial law imposed by terrorists. Families slept in the woods rather than their own homes, fearing what the night might bring. Children grew up knowing that the sound of horses after dark meant violence was coming. This was domestic terrorism on a massive scale, and it seemed unstoppable. The federal government was under enormous pressure to act, but many in Washington were hesitant. How do you fight an enemy that hides behind hoods and operates in the shadows? How do you enforce the law when local authorities are compromised? How do you protect people scattered across rural areas with limited federal resources? These questions paralyzed action for years while the terror continued. But something was about to change. Someone was about to push back. And it wasn't who the Klan expected. During the Civil War, nearly 180,000 black men had worn the Union uniform. They had fought in some of the bloodiest battles America had ever seen. They had proven their courage at Fort Wagner, at Milliken's Bend, at Petersburg. They had earned their freedom not as a gift, but as warriors who had paid for it in blood. And when the war ended, many of these soldiers didn't go north. They went home, back to the South, back to the communities they came from, back to the land they knew. But they didn't come back as slaves. They came back as men who had tasted dignity and freedom, men who had been trained to fight, to organize, to hold ground under fire, men who had looked death in the face and kept marching forward. The Klan had terrorized sharecroppers and former slaves who had never held weapons, never organized resistance. What the Klan didn't realize was that scattered among these communities were thousands of men who knew exactly how to fight back. These veterans had settled into civilian life, trying to farm, raise families, build futures. They had hoped peace would last. They had tried to live quietly. But as the Klan violence escalated through 1870 and into 1871, something shifted. There's only so much terror a man can watch before he decides enough is enough. These soldiers had fought one war for freedom. They were about to fight another. It started small. In communities where former soldiers lived, defense groups began to form. These weren't mobs or vigilantes. They were organized units, structured like military companies. The veterans used the training they had received in the Union Army. They established watch rotations, created signal systems, stockpiled weapons, and most importantly, they drilled the younger men in their communities on how to hold defensive positions. Word began spreading through the black grapevine. If the night riders come here, they're going to find us ready. The Klan noticed, but they didn't believe it. They had spent years terrorizing people who couldn't fight back effectively. They had grown arrogant, convinced of their own invincibility. They controlled the night, or so they thought. The idea that their victims might actually resist with organized military force seemed impossible to them. That arrogance was about to cost them everything. Spring of 1871, in York County, South Carolina. The Klan had planned what they expected to be another routine raid, a show of force against a black community that had been getting too ambitious, as they saw it. Some families there had registered to vote. Others had started a school. In the Klan's twisted logic, this required a violent lesson. They gathered over 100 riders, armed and hooded, ready to burn and terrorize as they had done countless times before. But this community was different. Several Union Army veterans lived there, and they had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. They had organized the men, positioned lookouts, created defensive perimeters around the most vulnerable homes. When the Klan riders came thundering down the road that night, expecting to find frightened, helpless people, they instead found themselves riding into an ambush. The first shots rang out from the darkness, precise and devastating. These weren't panicked shots from people who'd never held guns. These were volleys from men who had fought at Gettysburg, men who knew how to fire, reload, and fire again under pressure. The Klan riders scattered in confusion. Some fell from their horses. Others retreated in disorder. The invisible empire had just become very visible and very vulnerable. When dawn broke, the Klan had suffered casualties, their mystique shattered. More importantly, word of what happened spread like wildfire. Black communities across South Carolina and neighboring states heard the news. The night riders could be beaten. The terror wasn't invincible. Organized resistance worked. But the story doesn't end with one battle. What happened next was even more significant. President Ulysses S. Grant, himself a war hero, heard reports of both the Klan violence and the organized resistance. In April 1871, Congress passed what became known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, giving the federal government unprecedented power to combat domestic terrorism. Grant didn't hesitate. He declared martial law in 9 South Carolina counties and sent in federal troops. Here's where those black veterans became absolutely crucial. When federal forces arrived, they needed guides, intelligence, local knowledge. Who knew the terrain? Who knew which citizens were Klan members? Who knew where the terrorists hid their weapons and held their meetings? The black soldiers did. They became the eyes and ears of the federal campaign, working alongside U.S. troops to hunt down Klan members. The hunters had become the hunted. Suddenly, Klan members who had operated with impunity found themselves being arrested in mass numbers. Federal authorities conducted raids across multiple states. By the end of 1871, over 600 Klan members in South Carolina alone had been indicted. Hundreds more in other states faced arrest warrants. The secret organization was being exposed, its membership rolls seized, its leaders paraded into federal courtrooms. The trials were extraordinary. For the first time, Klan members faced real justice in federal courts, where they couldn't intimidate judges or juries. The testimony was damning. Stories of murder, torture, arson, all laid out in legal proceedings covered by newspapers across the nation. Some of the most prominent citizens in southern counties were revealed as terrorists. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen, clergymen, respectable members of society by day, violent extremists by night. The convictions came down hard. Prison sentences, heavy fines, public humiliation. And through it all, those black veterans stood as witnesses, as enforcers of justice, as living proof that resistance was possible. Their courage inspired others. More defense groups formed in communities across the South. Black men armed themselves legally and organized openly. The message was clear. The era of one-sided terror was over. The impact was devastating to the Klan. Membership collapsed. By 1872, Klan activity had dropped to a fraction of what it had been just a year earlier. Entire state chapters disbanded. Leaders fled or went into hiding. By 1874, the organization that had seemed unstoppable just 3 years before had effectively ceased to exist. They wouldn't resurface as a significant force for another 40 years, and when they did return in 1915, they would never again achieve the kind of dominance they had held in the early 1870s. Why? Because a precedent had been set. Because black soldiers had proven that organized resistance works. Because the federal government had proven that when it commits resources and political will, domestic terrorism can be crushed. The lessons of 1871 echoed forward through history. But here's what's heartbreaking. This story largely disappeared from our history books. Most Americans never learn about how black veterans organized and fought back against the Klan. They never hear about the military-style defense networks that made those communities too dangerous for the night riders to attack. They never learn about the crucial role these men played in helping federal forces dismantle the terror network. Why was this story buried? Because it complicates certain narratives. It shows black agency and military competence. It demonstrates that armed self-defense worked when properly organized. It proves that federal intervention, when done with commitment and resources, can defeat domestic terrorism. These are uncomfortable truths for some to acknowledge. But the legacy of what these soldiers did lives on, even if their names are largely forgotten. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 remains on the books today. Modern civil rights laws and anti-terrorism statutes trace their lineage back to that moment, when the federal government decided to take on domestic terror with full force. Every time prosecutors use federal conspiracy laws to go after hate groups, they're using legal tools forged in the fight these black veterans helped win. The impact went beyond law. These soldiers paved the way psychologically and strategically for future generations. When civil rights activists in the 1960s organized protection details for their communities, they were echoing the strategies of 1871. When the Deacons for Defense and Justice formed to protect civil rights workers from Klan violence, they were following a blueprint laid down nearly a century before. The knowledge that organized black resistance had once crushed the Klan gave courage to those who came after. The Klan would attempt several revivals over the following decades. They resurged in the 1920s, reaching millions of members nationwide. They reared their heads again during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, bombing churches and murdering activists. But they never again achieved the kind of territorial control they had in the early 1870s. They never again operated as an unchallenged terrorist state within a state. Why? Because the precedent of 1871 stood as proof. They could be beaten. Think about the courage it took for those black veterans to make that stand. They had already fought one war, already risked everything for freedom. They could have kept their heads down, tried to survive through submission and silence. Many people would have understood that choice, but they didn't make it. When terror came to their communities, they chose to fight again. They chose to organize, to arm themselves, to stand their ground. They chose to protect not just themselves, but their families, their neighbors, their futures. We don't know most of their names. History didn't record them as heroes. There are no monuments to the black veterans who organized the defense networks that helped crush the first Klan. There are no textbook chapters dedicated to their strategies and sacrifices, but their impact shaped America. They proved that terrorism could be defeated by combining grassroots resistance with federal commitment. They showed that those who had been enslaved could become the guardians of their own freedom. They demonstrated that the arc of justice doesn't bend on its own. It requires people willing to pull it forward, even at great personal risk. This is the history they don't teach, but it's the history we most need to learn. Because the lessons from 1871 still matter today. Organized hate still exists. Domestic terrorism still threatens. And the question of how free people defend their communities against terror is as relevant now as it was then. Those black soldiers answered that question with their courage, their organization, and their refusal to accept terror as their fate. They won a victory that resonated through generations. They deserve to be remembered not as victims of history, but as warriors who shaped it. This is the history they don't teach in schools, but it's the history we need to know. These black soldiers didn't just fight for freedom once. They fought for it twice, and they won. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you the untold chapters of history. Drop a comment and let me know. What other hidden stories should we uncover? And share this video, because this is a story that deserves to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.